Hi, it's Coach Anderson again, Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online U.S. History from 1877 to present. Today we're going to talk about progressivism, but we're going to talk about it specifically under two presidents, Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, who was Roosevelt's hand-picked successor when Roosevelt leaves office. Now, in the progressive movement, we've been talking about how it was, in the minds of many people, it was a responsibility of government, of course, to do what it could to improve American lives, either at the government level in terms of improving city government, or also creating some ways of improving Americans' lives when it comes to the right to vote, the right to do away with alcohol use and abuse in the country, of course, and also how to teach the immigrant, of course, to be a better American. So when we look at the progressive movement under Taft and Roosevelt, we're going to look at their viewpoints in terms of what the government should do, of course, to help when it comes to reforming American society. We're going to start, of course, with the unit focus question that we do, of course, in every one of the units that we go over. Every lesson we'll go through and tell you what the unit focus question is, because we want you to be aware of what it is that you're looking for as we go through the lesson. The unit focus question for Unit 5 is how can government fix the social problems? The do now activity that we have in your journal, once again, if you have a journal, I encourage you, of course, to take the journal out and write down any questions or any vocabulary word, of course, that you may have a question about, and you can go back and refer to them and answer those questions, because they'll be very helpful to you when, of course, you take the MAP assessment. It says the do now activity today in your journal, which you should write, is what do you associate the word pulpit with, and what images come to mind? So we'll give you a few moments to look over that particular question, and then write down what your responses would be, and we'll come back in a few seconds and we'll tell you what I think. Okay, you should have had enough time that you were able to go ahead, of course, and look at this particular question. The word that we have up on the screen here is pulpit. Well, when I think of pulpit, I think, of course, of being in church, and I think about, of course, the pastor, of course, up, at a podium, of course, and he's talking to us and he's preaching the word, of course, and giving us guidance. Well, when you look at the pulpit, we're going to talk about the pulpit too, but we're not going to talk about it in terms of looking at religion. We're going to talk about it in terms of the bully pulpit. And the bully pulpit was an idea that Theodore Roosevelt created. Now, he comes up with this idea of this bully pulpit, in which he basically said that because he's the president of the United States of America, and because of the power that he has a responsibility to use that office of the presidency to impact change, of course, for Americans in American society. We have vocabulary here. We have our academic vocabulary, of course, and then our content vocabulary. We will try to address these words, of course, as we go. If there is a chance, of course, that we miss one of them, you can always go back, of course, and look the words up for yourself. And you're probably going to learn a little bit better about it anyway if you look it up yourself anyway. The first lesson focus question, the only lesson focus question we have for lesson 2, is how did Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft's attitude toward progressivism align, and how did they diverge? In other words, how are they alike and how are they unalike? At this time, we will pause and see a video on the progressive era in America, how it originated, its impact, and students at this time, go ahead and access that video and enjoy the video and gain some great insights about the progressive movement and the improvement of America at that time. Theodore Roosevelt became president in September of 1901 when anarchist Leon Czolgosz assassinated William McKinley. He was an anarchist. He believed that the best government was no government, and there was a belief that a lot of Europeans, of course, that had in this particular country, when they came to this country, they brought with them this idea of anarchy. And he was an anarchist that believed that in some way that the president and the government of the United States of America had wronged him. We kind of believe that he suffered from some kind of mental issue, but there's no real way of knowing. We do know that because of his efforts, it's going to change the way that the presidency, of course, looks at societal issues. Roosevelt was a believer in social Darwinism when it came, of course, to business. He believed that when it came to international affairs, if you remember big stick diplomacy, what he basically meant, he said it was survival of the fittest. The strong would survive, of course, and the weak nations, of course, would fall. He's going to take that idea of social Darwinism a little bit also to the way that he runs his domestic program, which will be called the Square Deal. But we'll go into a little bit more depth about that a little later. Here's a picture of Leon Czolgosz, who was the assassin, of course, of William McKinley. A lot of people don't understand and know this here, but we had lost, of course, President Lincoln. We had lost, of course, President Garfield. And now we have a third president killed within the last 50 years. 3 presidents dead in 50 years. And one of the biggest reasons why we didn't have a selective service at that particular time. And presidents didn't really like all these guards and stuff anyway. They wanted to be, of course, amongst the people. But when McKinley dies, for the first time, we start to recognize there's a need for the selective service, which protects the president in the office, of course, and even when they leave office, they still have selective service protection. Roosevelt is trust buster. Now, Roosevelt understood that businesses were important and necessary, of course, in the United States of America. And because of that, we're going to find that he's reluctant to get involved in regulating businesses because he believes in laissez-faire. But he recognizes that some of the problems that American citizens have is because of the lack of competition that these big corporations have. So even though he's pro-business and pro-laissez-faire, he does understand that the government does need to regulate business to some degree. Roosevelt was the first president to aggressively use the Sherman Antitrust Act to regulate big business. His actions as a trust buster made him popular with the public. So even though he doesn't really want to regulate big businesses, he does, and because of that, he's going to be beloved by the American public. Roosevelt's use of the Sherman Antitrust Act in the Northern Securities case caused a lot of debate about what constitutes interstate commerce or trade or business, of course, that cross state lines. Because of this Northern Securities case, it's going to increase or broaden the scope and where the government, of course, could come in and regulate businesses that went across state lines. The Northern Securities case set the groundwork to give the government even more access to regulate business. So because of the Supreme Court ruling in the Northern Securities case, for the first time, it's gonna give basically the government permission to do what it can, of course, to regulate big businesses. Now, the American worker loves it. American business owners, not so much. The coal strike of 1902 showed Roosevelt's willingness to use the power of the presidency in business affairs. Now, once again, we told you that he was reluctant, of course, to get involved in affairs of business, but in 1902, he uses a threat to the United Mine Workers. He told them when they went on strike in 1902, if you don't go back to work, we're gonna send the American military in and they're gonna work for you. So because of that threat, they go back to work, and of course, and for the first time, we have a situation where the president and the government actively go out and interfere. Not that they hadn't done it before, but it's one of the first times that they're recognized as interfering, of course, in business and labor in this particular case. Like most Republicans of his day, he was pro-business, Roosevelt was, and we told you that because of him being pro-business, it's what endeared him to most of the American public, but businesses not so much. He created the Department of Commerce and Labor as one of the cabinet departments, and their responsibility was to look at the affairs and activities of big business. He passed the Hepburn Act in 1906 and helped create the Interstate Commerce Commission that would prosecute or enforce laws that dealt with the regulation, of course, of anybody that violated interstate commerce or unregulated business. He also passed a couple of laws. One of the laws that was passed was called the Meat Inspection Act, and the other one, the Pure Food and Drug Acts. When you look at both of those acts, what it is to protect the American consumer in terms of the meat that they eat. One of the things that happens is going to be, I was seeing if I had it for you, but we had a muckraker by the name of Upton Sinclair. I think we'll talk about him for a few seconds before we move on. Upton Sinclair wrote a book called The Jungle. in that jungle, in that book, The Jungle, what he basically talked about was how poor meat was handled. And because of the conditions in which it was handled with the rats and different things, it was very unsanitary, and because of it, it affected the public health. So because of actions like that, we're going to find that the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act are going to be created to protect American public interest. Roosevelt also was noted for being an environmental conservationist, a person that wanted to protect America's natural resources. His efforts led to the creation of the national park system, which set aside millions of acres of public land to safeguard natural resources. One of the big issues, we were talking about different things, of course, that you could possibly talk about that would be something that the government, of course, could do. An issue that we're facing is drilling on national set-asides, or drilling on government lands to get oil and things like that. So when we look at it, we're going to find that there are a lot of different things that the government, of course, has the responsibility, of course, of making decisions about. And the important thing to understand is not everybody, of course, is going to agree with them, and not everybody's going to like them. But the government has to make decisions in the public interest. Roosevelt passed the New Lands Reclamation Act, which allowed for the sale of public lands to finance irrigation and land development projects in the West. Well, if you've ever been to the West, one of the things, the western part of the United States of America, one of the things you'll notice is a very dry place. And because of the New Lands Reclamation Act, what it did is it created a series of dams and aqueducts, of course, and reservoirs that were created, of course, to make sure that we could irrigate different places in the West. In 1906, Roosevelt created the U.S. Forestry Service to manage millions of acres of government land. Here's Gifford Pinchot. He was one of Roosevelt's friends, and he believed, like Roosevelt believed, that America's national forest should be managed by experts like himself. He studied in Europe about their forestry program, and brought those same ideas, of course, to the American landscape. Here's a picture of one of my favorite people. His name is John Muir. He was an American naturalist that influenced the creation of Yosemite National Park. And one of the things that he wrote, one of his most famous sayings that I kind of like to think about a little bit, is that everybody needs beauty as well as bread, places to play in and pray in, where nature may heal and give strength to body and soul. Now that's some deep thinking right there. So when he thinks about nature, when he thinks about America's natural forest, that's his church. So when you think about John Muir, he's one of the most recognized conservationists and naturalists, of course, in American history. Here's a picture of Yosemite Valley in California. It's the home of the redwoods. Roosevelt's legacy centered around using the presidency as a bully pulpit. There's that word that we had. And it increased the role of government in business by setting interstate commerce rates and bringing antitrust lawsuits. Roosevelt's legacy also was as a conservationist, set aside millions of acres of federal land for Americans to enjoy with the National Park Service.